Welcome to the Survivors to Thrivers podcast. I am your host, Joshua Blattman. This series is a safe space to explore ideas with a focus on science, healing, and spirituality. We share stories of struggle, journeys of healing, tools for triumph, and explore the ingredients of transformation. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Johan Calleman. With a PhD in physical biology, experience as a senior researcher, and several published scientific papers, Dr. Calleman is known for his theory that the Mayan calendar reflects the evolution of the global mind. For nearly 40 years, Dr. Calleman has been exploring how the Mayan calendar system correlates with consciousness shifts and biological evolution. I became interested in his writings through my fascination in how humans perceive time, particularly folks who've been affected by existential crises and trauma. Dr. Calleman has dedicated his life to identifying the underlying evolutionary processes that govern human history and our individual lives, using the Mayan calendar as an inroad to some of the most fundamental problems of human existence. He is the author of several books, including The Global Mind and the Rise of Civilization, and his most recent book is called The 9 Waves of Creation, Quantum Physics, Holographic Evolution, and the Destiny of Humanity. For further learning about his work, check out his website, calleman.com. Welcome, Johan Calleman. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. I'm just looking forward to talk to you on this podcast.
Yeah, great. There's a lot in that title, and before I get into those main topics, quantum physics, holographic evolution, and the destiny of humanity, as well as the 9 ways of creation, I found you because I'm personally trying to negotiate with my own concept of time. Mm-hmm. And American society, the society that I grew up in and that we're all so familiar with, has a very linear perspective of time. I don't know that I totally agree with that. And
mm-hmm.
You're an expert in Mayan culture, and Mayan culture has somewhat of a different idea, and I don't really know how much about that. I think most people have heard of the Mayan culture, and maybe they've heard of the Mayan calendar, and maybe they've heard of the Mayan calendar ending a few years ago, and people are like not really knowing what that means or what that means for us today and our future.
Yeah.
So I kind of was hoping you could give me some insight, about that. What is time?
Yeah. Well, I think to begin with, a good distinction to make is the one that the ancient Greeks would do. They basically had 2 different gods symbolizing different kind of time. One god was called Kronos, and the other god was called Kairos. And Chronos is basically the only concept of time that modern society acknowledges. It's basically measurable time. Mm-hmm. It's how long time does it take for so-and-so to run this distance, and that kind of questions can be answered with that concept of time. Mm-hmm. Now, then there is another kind. The god that they talked about as Kairos was qualitative time, and it's fundamentally linked to the whole concept of timing. In other words, we experience that if we go into that type of time, we may, for instance, experience that it is time for something. And throughout the history of humankind, there has always been these things that it's been the right time for those kind of certain kinds of events, because the quality of time undergoes a certain kind of change. And I would say that this quality of time is really then what the Mayan calendar describes. It's not at all interested in quantitative time, in measuring how fast things go or these kind of things. Rather, it is based on underlying processes in the quantum field, you might say, that makes certain things the right time for. So I think that's a very significant aspect to realize when you are approaching the Mayan calendar, that it actually comes from this timing aspect, what the ancient Greek would assign to the god Kairos rather than Chronos. Now, the Mayan calendar then, as I'm particularly interested in, is the ancient version, the one that was used about 2,000 years ago when people were writing all these inscriptions in stone about certain the timing of things. And they used a number of symbols. Could be flowers, could be a different kind of birds, or different kind of deities that they perceived as ruling certain time periods. And when a certain deity ruled a certain time period, then that time period would gain a certain quality. And that quality of time would determine the kinds of events and experiences that that particular time period would give. So I think that's a little bit a short description of how I understand the Mayan calendar. So it's a very different way of looking at time. In fact, it is the only calendar system that is not based on the material reality. All other calendars, as far as I know, are based on astronomical cycles. And that's not the case with the Mayan calendar. And that's why it gives it such a special role for everyone who is thinking about the matter of time, etc.
Right. Yeah, so chronos is like chronology and logical sequences of events, right? That's where that word comes from, I imagine?
Yeah. Chronology comes from the god Kronos, yes.
And kairos, that word comes from, I don't know, when I hear kairos, I think chiron, and I think astrology, and I think the wounded person.
It's not spelled the same way. It's spelled Kairos. Yeah.
Okay, so I get the idea. Like, a big question for me in the last couple of years when I started to look back at how how the journey of like the previous 15 years after my traumatic brain injury and coma, and like how that time period just like seemed to feel like kind of a spin out, yet had its own sort of evolutions. I started to think, why did that happen at that time? And why did those patterns, like I started to look for patterns to try to understand and make sense of what had been happening, and not only what had been happening, but where I am and where I'm going. And that idea of kairos, with it being so fundamentally it sounds like it's fundamentally non-linear, like the chronos idea. So maybe, can you help me understand, like, are there stages of kairos? How do I get a bigger global concept of how kairos
that's what I said. The Mayan calendar has certain symbols. They could be deities, or they could be birds, or so forth, that describe sequences, you might say, stages, if you like, in processes, which are collective human. They may even be cosmic, but certainly these processes affect the entire humanity. Typically there are processes that are developed in 13 stages. That's really what much of their calendar is based on.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How do I understand those 13 stages?
Well, basically, they are described as a process going from a seed to a mature fruit. So the first step, the first of these 13 stages would be the seeding stage. And then the third stage would be something like germination, and then it would go on to budding, flowering, and fruition.
Sure.
So these processes then are what have developed, for instance, the civilizations of humanity, but at many different levels, processes of evolution of the entire cosmos have followed those kind of 13-step processes.
Interesting. Is there any overlap there with a couple other ideas, like bigger ideas, like the hero's journey?
Like what? The hero's journey?
Yeah, you've heard of the hero's journey. It's
Yeah.
Is there any overlap with all life, as far as these different stories I've heard, start with the seed, whether the seed is literally a seed or the seed is an idea or the seed is the beginning of a project or whatever it is, and then it evolves to become its full-blown completed project. That whole cycle seems to be kind of consistent throughout different streams of thought, and is kind of encapsulated in this idea called the hero's journey.
Yes. Yes, I'm sure it is encapsulated in many thought systems. The difference is that this Mayan calendar is timed. In other words, where it also talks about the entire collective processes of humanity. The timing doesn't necessarily apply to the individual. It applies to the entire planet and properly to the entire cosmos. And so it's a little bit a different thing. Now, we as individuals, we are to different degrees part of these collective processes that form the destiny of humanity. And to the extent that we do, we will be influenced by these processes, and our lives will resonate with these overall large-scale collective processes that the Mayan calendar describes. But there is a strict timing. I should add that. Maybe not for the individual, because the individual's resonance is, it is subject to a lot of different factors. But to the collective processes, it is strictly timed.
Where are we now in that timing sequence then?
Well, when it comes to what you might call the prophetic Mayan calendar system, it has 9 different levels, 9 different waves, like sine waves, you might say.
Yeah.
And October 28, 2011 was a very significant time, because that was the time when all of these 9 levels had attained their 13th stage.
So that ties that 13 stages into the 9 levels that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay.
But these 9 levels, these 13 stages, they each have their own frequency, so to speak. Now after this, it's a much more complex situation of an interference pattern that we're living in, and some of these waves have gone into you might say a dark phase, or whereas others are still operating on with a high frequency. This question, where are we now, it's a little bit too complex to even go into without much more background, really. I know that's what people are wanting to hear, but the truth is that it is a little bit more complicated. What's new after this shift that happened in 2011 is that all the 9 waves are, for the first time in history, they are active and running in parallel.
Interesting. So wait a second. So let me back up just a second. So I read something in your bio in one of the many pages that I read in preparation for this call, that was that the 6th wave happened at like 3100, I think it was 3115 BCE, which is like 5100 plus years ago. And then the 7th wave was more recent. And then each one seems to be progressively and dynamically shorter. Like the 7th wave happened probably, what was it, like 100 years, like in the last couple 100 years? And
the 7th wave started in 1755 AD.
1755 AD, so kind of just before the American Revolution.
Yeah, it's part of it.
Okay.
It's part of it.
And then the 8th wave was the Industrial Revolution. 1990?
1999. So it's the digital revolution.
Digital. Okay.
The American revolutions coincided with the Industrial Revolution, you might say.
Yeah, interesting. I wonder then, are there mathematical patterns in like I'm thinking about the I forget the name of the shape for it, but like all like shells seem to match this mathematical shape, just like the spinning galaxy represents this mathematical shape.
Yeah, I would say there are these waves have repercussions on several different levels of the universe, and I mean they have influence on the galactic level, as you mentioned. But I always try to focus on the consequences of them on the actual human level. But that's not to say that they don't have effects also on other levels. They do. We know that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the how, as above, so below, and just like the as within, so without, and like establishing some connection between the microcosm of like the really small things, like the spiraling and I guess centrifugal nature of like a shell, as well as the centrifugal nature of a galaxy. And creating some like consistency with those bigger ideas.
Yes.
And you said that you're focused on bringing those down to the human level and making them practical for people. Help me make meaning of all this.
Well, the different waves are each wave carries a certain kind of mind, and each wave then associated with that kind of mind comes a certain perception of reality, and when a perception of reality is created, then people would tend to recreate that perception in their outer worlds, so to speak. So, the ancients would talk about these different time periods as associated with what they would refer to as different worlds. And the thing is that if our perception of reality changes, then we will tend to see the world differently and recreate it differently. And so there's a bunch of these different worlds then, obviously 9 worlds, you might say. Okay. And the kind of societies that human beings have created have depended on the mind that they have downloaded from these waves. And that's the reason that throughout through history, the societies have really undergone a lot of change. Broadly speaking, for instance, until 1755, you had no democracies in the world. But after that shift in the human mind that came with the seventh wave, the democracy became an ideal. Basically, the seventh wave provided a less dualistic mind frame for people to download. And you can track these changes very exactly, and that's what I do in my books. You can see how step by step, usually in a 13-step process, which is then really the same thing as in the Jewish Bible, the 7 days and 6 nights of God's creation. That's the 13, the process of peaks and valleys, or light and dark phases of this particular wave movement. But the point is, as I said, is that in 2011, all the last of these 9 waves were activated, and so they're all there, and in a sense running in parallel, and we can choose to resonate with any of these different waves, and to some extent we resonate with all of them, but then again, people are not affected similarly by these wave changes, and that's when you might say a free choice comes in. Right. And the interesting thing, though, with the 9th wave is that it's the highest frequency wave, and it is one that basically brings a non-dualistic mind to people. It's sort of it's the return of unity after separation, you might say. So in terms of being part of manifesting the destiny of humanity, a very important thing to do is to become aware of the 9th wave, which then defines a collective process towards unity consciousness, towards an altered perception of reality. And this will not happen over just at a certain occasion or a certain date. It's a process that comes out of resonating with this particular wave over a longer period of time, and aligning with the highest frequency wave of creation, and then meaning aligning with the destiny of unity of humankind.
A lot, wow. So number one, why would I want to change? I like my life now. Why would I want it to change? Like, why do I want to push this 9th wave stuff? Like, being a hypothetical anybody, you know?
Yeah, no, that's a choice. It's not something. Why would you? Well, presumably over time you will be left behind unless you are developing resonance with this highest frequency. If you look at the way history has unfolded under the influence of these different waves, you can see that some people have been left behind, and many civilizations have perished, and so forth. And you may say that is exactly because they have not been adapting to resonate with a highest available frequency that's out there.
Oh, that's interesting.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but then again, it has to come out of a choice, I think, or an intention, you might might say. You have to tell yourself, or you have to ask yourself, do I want a world that is dominated by a perception of duality, where you separate people, or do you want a world that's dominated by unity, where you try to include people, where you no longer endorse dominance, etc. Yeah. And that's a choice. It's there's sort of no guarantee that this unity framework will be what you want for your personal life or like that. I can't tell that, because it's a whole it's a collective process, and so you have to make the decision of living your life in a framework of the collective destiny of humanity or not, I would say. And yeah, it's
that allows for a lot more. That's an interesting idea, because I've been like thinking about this as a concept of fate and free will, and the galaxy is doing this thing, and all these different energies are set into motion, and we're kind of at effect from the universe, and these things are already happening whether we like it or not. And so what kind of free will do we have in our lives to be self-efficient, or to be a cause in our lives? And when you say that we have the choice to participate or to not participate, really kind of insists to me that it's literally a choice whether to participate in this higher frequency resonance or to kind of not, and decide to stay outside of the evolutionary trajectory of I guess universal resonance.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And that idea of resonance. So I've been a musician my whole life. So when you talk about resonance, you're like kind of speaking my language.
Yeah.
And when you say 9 waves, it kind of what's resonant for me, pun intended, I guess, is the chakra system. There's ancient traditions. There's 7 chakras, plus I've heard of this idea of an 8th chakra that's like 2 inches above your head, and then I've heard also, and less frequently, about the idea of a 9th chakra that is higher above your head and is more connected to a universal mind. Is there any traction for those ideas in your expertise?
Well, I think originally in India they talked about 4 chakras, and then, as you said, what is in more recent times have become the norm has been the idea of 7 chakras, and then there are other people that have added 8th and 9th chakras. And I can easily imagine that these are reflection of the activation of different waves. Because these waves, as I talked about earlier, they're sequentially activated, or you talked about it. There was one then that was started in 3115, and maybe then that activated the 6th chakra, and then 1755 came to the 7th, and then maybe that's that's the more recent times, and that would give 7th chakra and so forth. To actually prove this in any sort of certain way, I think will never happen, but it's a possible way of thinking, and it may very well be true. I mean, it certainly makes sense, and especially if the 9th chakra is something that's sort of a higher thing. It's above our individual bodies, so to speak, and connects to change that happens in the in the collective, in a higher level, so to speak. And it's this brings me to think about a colleague of mine, Patricia Albere, who's been developing this mutual awakening processes, which really then is an evolutionary relationships, you might say, where the relationship develops from above, you might say, from the space between the individuals, or above the individuals, you might say. And that's sort of exactly what you would expect from the ninth wave, in the same sense that you are suggesting here, that the ninth chakra is above this. It's once you remove the dark fields of the dualistic mind, you will create an openness to all that is. So things won't be that individual as we've been used to for a long time.
Oh, I love that idea. There's the dualistic mind and unity. The word, non-dualism is a concept that you mentioned. You mentioned the Jewish spiritual practices. That's also really resonant for me, because I am Jewish. And grew up in this, like, not, it's the idea that everything is part of the same oneness, and there is only oneness, and there is only everything which is encapsulated in this grand circle of oneness, and so everything we have the same thing.
Everything is one, and has always been one, mm-hmm. But it's not that simple, because these different what should I say, dualities of mind have created different perceptions over time. And that's why people have very much acted outside of this reality of a one, or oneness. And as I understand these different different waves, the ninth wave now enables us to return to this perception of unity, and then also a life in unity. And that, you might say, to refer to the Jewish thing, that there is in the Jewish tradition the idea of a return to the Garden of Eden.
Right.
And I believe that's what they're talking about. That can only come out of a shift in the human perception of reality.
Right. Yeah, that's the idea of messianic consciousness. But if going down the train of messianic consciousness is something that could stir up a lot of I don't know, different, like, I feel like it's just a baggagey idea, if you know what I mean. I feel like there's just people who turn off when you start talking about messianic consciousness.
I absolutely, and it's not just something you need to use a megaphone to spread. It's something that happens if you are living it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you mean. Like, if you're living the idea that all is one, then all is one, and all the different resonant ideas the resonance seems to be apparent. It's the idea that from different classes that I've taken with this interesting thinker who, I don't need to get into other people's names, but resonance and being able to see, like, being able to perceive the energies of what's real, even though you don't necessarily see it in front of you. And is the idea of resonance is that I can just speak to off the top of my head. I want to ask you about a couple, like you say quantum holographic perspective. What does that mean? And how do those are some big words and I don't really know what that means.
Yeah, okay. Well, you might say that the concept of quantization, that's at the heart of quantum theory. And basically, it was developed because energies were found to have associated with the quantized frequencies. And this is exactly what is true then for the 9 different waves. They operate on 9 different frequencies. And so it's sort of consistent with the worldview that was developed about 100 years ago when quantum mechanics first came into existence, which really is that you can also look at everything as waves. Everything is waves and wave frequencies. Now that's the quantum thing. The holographic thing is really then what you already mentioned, as above, so below, which is a characteristic of any kind of holographic structure, that you have reproductions of on several different levels, the planet, the solar system, the galaxy, the cosmos, of certain phenomena. And in that sense, you may talk about the universe as holographic. And I guess was there another word that I need to expand on? Or
quantum holographic perspective.
Quantum holographic, well, that's just the 2 of them, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, the idea that everything is waves and frequencies.
Yeah. Waves with certain frequencies, yes.
As we're moving, as a species, as we're moving through these various waves, you kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning when I asked you, where are we going? These waves are getting shorter, and these waves are kind of coming to this unity consciousness, or to this point where they're all, well, I guess they are overlaid on top of each other. Similar to like, a vertical alignment of energy chakras in our bodies. You said that without going into a lot more detail, I really want to know, like, what can we, I really want to ask you about what we can expect and what do you anticipate happening in the next, where does this trajectory of the 9 waves of creation and they're coming together, you said, where does it go? Where does it go?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I'll help you boil it down to simple terms if we can. Sorry,
well, as I said, these waves are running in parallel. Each of these waves have their own effect. The 6th wave is the big civilizational wave, so to speak, and that has turned into a night that will last for a fairly long time. And one of the predictions you may make from that is really then that we're at the beginning of the end of the Western dominance in the world. And exactly how that will happen, I cannot say, but I think you see a lot of signs of it happening in the United States at this particular time. there's throughout there's been a long time this kind of question about why certain cultures have supposedly disappeared, and for instance, everybody knows that the Roman Empire collapsed or came to an end, and so forth, and that's really because there are these underlying waves. The rise and fall of the Roman Empire very precisely follows the sixth wave process, and something similar is now going on with the Western dominance, the Western civilization.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that is happening, and then we talked about this with I should also, another thing that's happening is the eighth wave, which favors the right brain half and basically the femininity, and that we will see much more. We see it very strongly now. Women, at least working towards some kind of an equality, maybe even taking over. I don't really know. It wouldn't be surprising after 5,000 years of male dominance, but at the very least, this Western dominance that it has been very much linked to male dominance in the world, and that's been the case for about 5,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's changing, and it's essentially the eighth wave that is bringing that. But then the ninth wave is sort of above those kind of dualities of genders or even East-West dualities that have dominated the world today. So that's where the ninth wave then is really, as I said, is changing the perception to unity, and to the extent that manifests, that will ultimately bring forth a world in peace and in collaboration and on a very global scale, not the kind of nationally based world that we see today. But the timing of this is not completely clear. I think a big step towards this unity will be happening in the year 2031. I think in June or 2031 is the shift point, and that's that's when the seventh wave goes into a day, you might say. In other words, or a peak in its wave evolution. So, I'm just touching upon it, but it has to do also, these things have to do with how much will people understand what is going on a deeper level. What the Mayan calendar is the deep level. It's not just what happens today or tomorrow and the details of it. It's the underlying waveforms that determine the future of our existence. And people need to understand that, but they also need to make this kind of an intentional choice to be a beacon of unity. And to the extent that they do, I think they will increasingly develop resonance with the ninth wave and the direction of humanity that destiny provides. So it's not. I mean, it's impossible for me to say that to what extent people would choose this. It's just obvious that there's a lot of people out there that are not choosing that at all, and at the same time, you do see an increasing number of people choosing it, and that's really what it is. I do think that it's sort of 2031 will mean something essentially positive, a higher form of integration of these waves than we've seen up until now.
Yeah, that's neat. You said this. You said it's the seventh wave that will open up in
Yeah.
2031, and
Well,
the
open
seventh.
up is, it's more like this. It's a waveform with peaks alternating with
Yeah.
valleys.
Right.
So it's now the seventh wave is now in a valley, and
Uh-huh.
at that point it will become in a peak again.
Uh-huh. What was the what was about the year when in the last like valley peak transition of the seventh wave?
But the seventh wave, it was 2011. It turned into a night after having been, or a valley, if you like, after having been in a peak since 1992.
Okay, so the seventh wave seems to go. Oh, that's so the first one was 19 years, and this one's 10 years, or no, that one's also
No,
19 years, 20 years.
yeah, it's
Interesting.
19.7 years, really. So it's so it doesn't even. It's not always you. Yeah,
It's not
19.7.
identical.
Yeah.
Sure, interesting. I think I read on one of the sites that the one of the ancient Chinese or Asian cultures ran their ran their society based on these 20-year cycles for like 900 years.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
That's a pretty long civilization.
Yeah.
I think something that our 235-year society could could aspire to.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you about snakes, and I
Yeah.
want to ask you about the emergence of a cosmic axis. And the cosmic axis is a kind of a big idea, especially with this idea of the cosmic tree of life.
Mm-hmm.
And that tree of life idea is kind of traces back to the as above, so below idea. Would you prefer to talk about the snakes or prefer to talk about the tree of life first?
Well, um, the snakes, I could, it's. I remember the first time when came to Chichen Itza, which is this most visited Mayan temple site,
Right.
and found it quite surprising that they have had as their main deity the plumed serpent.
Yeah.
The central temple at that particular site is dedicated to the plumed serpent. And, why would that be? And now, of course, since then, I've done a lot of studies of how things work also in other parts of the world. And you do find that several ancient cultures or even existing cultures look upon a serpent as the main creator god. In Australia, the Aborigines have this the rainbow serpent. Among the Bushmen in southern Africa, which is probably the world's oldest existing culture, they look upon a giant python as a creator god, and you find the same in the Amazonas, where people say that the great anaconda was the creator of the human beings. And how would that be, or why would that be? I mean, immediately it doesn't make sense. Just looking at a snake, it's not the most highly developed animals as we think of them. But if you instead change your perspective to recognize that these people experienced a wave-like movement of their societies. And when it comes to the Maya, we have detailed explanations of that. They looked upon they looked upon the plumed serpent as the bringer of civilization. But then sometimes the plumed serpent would disappear, and then the civilizations will go down with it.
Oh.
And so what that tells us is that, it tells me anyway, is that really what they were talking about was their experience of a wave movement.
Yeah.
And this wave movement then is exactly what the divine plan operates through.
Yeah.
Uh, so and you find these the serpent is such a power animal in so many different traditions that it makes sense to look upon it in this particular way. And then
So
if I,
to
yeah,
trace the thought there, I was like, I've been, in preparation to get for this conversation, I was like, I've been thinking a lot about the snakes idea and like, what is snakes and what is waves? And then I think to take what you're kind of saying in terms of, as you're describing snakes and waves, the idea that a slithering snake is the silhouette of a wave, and the rising and falling, if you look at it from the vertical and you look down at a snake slithering, it looks like a wave. Like,
yeah,
and that also that also looks like a sine wave.
yeah,
So in terms of frequencies and resonance, and the rolling unfolding of time, I can see how the perspective of an ancient person who had no concept of science like we have today
yeah,
would
right,
look at that rolling unfolding, the image of the snake rolling unfolding, and the experience of the rolling unfolding through the passage of time as a metaphorically symbolic like idea.
yeah.
Neato.
Well said. Well said. I think. Well said.
That took a lot to get to that spot.
Yeah.
So let's transition then into the cosmic axis idea.
Yeah.
What is that all about?
Well, it's not it's not so much an idea as a fact that is not widely known, but over the past 15 years, essentially, scientific cosmologists have been studying the universe to see if there are inherent irregularities in it. And they've done that, I think, primarily through sending up a series of 3 different satellites that have been measuring the afterglow of the Big Bang, and to see if there is any indication that there is any kind of pattern in how the universe have appeared from its very beginning. And I think that's an important point, that these, when they study what's called the microwave background of the universe, they're basically taking a baby picture of the universe, how it looked from its very inception. And what it turns out is that there has been, they found an axis that goes through the entire universe. And this was discovered initially in 2003 with with the second of these different satellites. And then it's been verified later with the second of the satellites, which is only a couple of years ago, and the fact that both satellites sent back data that were consistent really makes it quite clear that from the very beginning of the universe, there's been an axis in it. And in my interpretation,
Can you help me understand what you mean by axis? Because, like,
it's a line. You might say it's a non-material line. But then more recent studies have found that this line basically separates the universe in various, in like one sky half, which has one character, and another sky half, which has another character. And basically, I would say this is like a yin-yang separation of the entire universe. that these later studies have discovered. In other words, if you divide the universe into hemispheres along this line, you will find that the number of certain radio sources, of certain types of galaxies, of certain types of quasars, are different on those two hemispheres. This should be, really totally shocking to anyone who has thought about this matter, because we have basically come to, we've grown up with the idea that basically the universe is kind of the same in all kinds of directions, and that there is really no up or down, and things are floating around there sort of randomly, whether they are galaxies or quasars or neutron stars or whatever. And what is now coming out of these studies and this cosmic axis, that originally was called the axis of evil by the scientists at MIT that discovered it. They called it that because it was just an affront to the entire conception of reality that has come out of the modern view of physics. And so, because then this line, invisible line you might call it, this axis apparently divides the universe in two halves with certain different properties. I have concluded that this is really recovering the ancient knowledge of the tree of life, which then really in ancient views, take the Jewish view, and you have the tree of life, and you look at these old pictures, then it's always a duality that tree establishes. It's always males on one side of the tree and women or a woman on the other side. They knew somehow that there was a principal structure organizing yin-yang polarity that pervaded the universe. They would not have been able to demonstrate it with a kind of sophistication that modern satellite technologies allowed. But on the other hand, to the ancients, that may not have been so important. What was more important to them was the actual intuitive perception of how the universe was organized.
Right.
And so this is a case of something that hasn't come out among the public, and I think it would really be of interest to the public at large to know that there is such a fundamental, I would say, structure-giving principle to the universe, and presumably, in my view anyway, that's really the origin of all life and all structured life in the universe.
Yeah. Wow. What comes up for me when in that explanation is the idea of science and the quantified mind that our modern society requires for legitimacy, basically.
Yeah.
Is heavily lined up with the idea of chronological time and the idea of things being more personified and sensitive and experienced to be true without necessarily needing the hard data behind it to back it up, being something that's more lined up with that idea of personified rather than, as an extra layer on top of the quantified, or in separation, something that it could be lined up but isn't necessarily necessary in conjunction with the quantified.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of like correlation between because we've got two ideas here. We've got the quantified idea and the personified idea, which are also separated by the idea of chronos and kairos. Is there any kind of like, can I draw some personally, can I draw some resonance between the idea of personified and kairos? Is there a connection in those ideas?
Personified and kairos. Can you expand on this personified, the meaning of that?
Yeah, totally. So in my trying to understand the global by taking it down to two things and then parsing it out and creating trees of knowledge out of things, which is kind of super relevant, but not necessarily exacting to the tree of life idea. But if you tree out a knowledge system and you look at quantified and personified, just like you're looking at chronos and kairos. If you look at quantified and you're like mathematizing and quantifying and systematizing and dualizing everything down to digitizing, you've got things that are very systematizable and can almost like operate with a computer without necessarily human intervention. Then we start to think about put that in a bucket and it's like its own little quarantined area. But then you've got everything else that is all the ideas of beauty and ethos, personified being the stories and mythology of Greek culture, and how they used mythology to explain the movements of the stars and the planets, and the kind of rolling experience that you talk about with the snake idea, with the snake in relation to waves, and the personified then being highly resonant to the idea of the of those waves that we're talking about. So then I wonder, with personified and the characters and the hero's journey, any kind of resonant overlap between personified with that verbose definition and the idea of kairos, spelled Kairos. Is there overlap there?
Well, I would say that kairos is something that it really is a personified experience of time, because it's the individual who gives the meaning to synchronicities and to timing and so forth. If you have the chronos concept of time, there's no real personal meaning attached to that. In fact, it's meant to be objective. So, you may give your meaning to things happening at certain times in sync with certain other things that you know about. But that is the personified meaning. And yes, that is what I would say that goes together with the kairos experience of time.
Neato. Cool. Wow. That's neat. What else comes up for you in terms of things that we should talk about that we haven't gotten to yet? I see this destiny of humanity idea and like this idea of shift points that I don't really understand.
Well, I guess one thing I want to say is that unless you actually read my books, or at least some book, this may sound like just loosely talking about various kind of phenomena, but the reality is that there is a tremendous amount of evidence provided, and evidence then really very often means synchronicities that you may find associated with certain shift points in the evolutionary processes. I guess I want to say that I'm not just sort of talking loosely about good ideas or something like that. I really have a lot of underlying evidence of these processes, but since they're not very well known, and the result is that it may sound like it's loose talk, but it isn't.
I really appreciate you establishing that there's scientific evidence that backs up all these ideas. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.